Back. Welcome back. We're starting. Thank you for joining us for our keynote panel, From Case to IAUS. Our panelists tonight will examine the links and divergences between the Conference of Architects for the Study of the Environment and the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. I'm just going to introduce our guest here, or moderator for the panel is Sylvia Lavin. Sylvia is a critic, historian, and curator whose work explores the limits of architecture across a wide spectrum of historical periods. She received her PhD from Columbia University and published her first books, Cathédrale de Quincy and the Invention of a Modern Language of Architecture, and Form Follows Libido, Architecture and Richard Neutra in a Psychoanalytic Culture, with the MIT Press. Recent books include Flash in the Pan, Kissing Architecture, and Everything Loose Will Land, the catalog accompanying an exhibition focusing on art and architecture in Los Angeles during the 1970s. Her next exhibition, The New Creativity, explores transformations in architectural creativity since the advent of computing. In organizing this conference, you may have noticed we decided to separate the three directives of case, Kenneth Frampton, Peter Eisenman, and Stanford Anderson, into separate panels during the day. That was strategic. In order to pursue different inflections and divergences in their thought, and now we wanted to reunite them, but Peter is going to sit this one out, but perhaps participate from the audience. So Kenneth Frampton, you know him already, but I'll just mention that in 1972, he became a fellow of the IAUS and was a co-founding editor of its journal Oppositions. Stanford Anderson, who has already been introduced. I just want to highlight that he was a part of IAUS, and among his publications we have On Streets from 1978, which was an IAUS project. And we are lucky to have these case members joined by two scholars who were also part of IAUS. Anthony Vidler, who has a diploma in architecture from Cambridge, a PhD from TU Delft, and is professor of architecture at the Cooper Union, and Vincent Scully, visiting professor of architectural history at Yale. A historian and critic, Vidler taught at Princeton, where he chaired the PhD program, and at UCLA as chair of the Department of Art History. His publications include The Writing of the Walls, Claude Nicolas Ledoux, The Architectural Uncanny, Warped Space, Histories of the Immediate Present, and James Fraser Stirling. He received the Architecture Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2011 and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he was editor of Oppositions. And finally, Joan Ockman is Distinguished Senior Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design and visiting professor at Cooper Union and Cornell. She directed the Temple Hoin Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture at Columbia from 1994 to 2008. And among her books, we have Architecture Culture, 1943 to 1968, The Pragmatist Imagination, Thinking About Things in the Making, and Architecture School, 3 Centuries of Educating Architects in North America. She began her career at the IAUS in New York in the 1970s and was an editor of its journal Oppositions and of the Oppositions book series. Joan has agreed to do a short presentation of the IAUS to get us started, after which we'll just get started with the panel. So Joan and everybody else, thanks.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Thank you, Arindam, for this invitation. It's an honor to be on this panel with 3 people whom I consider to have been mentors for me throughout my career, and also with Stan, who I've known somewhat over the years and even had some opportunity to work over a manuscript or 2 while I was at Oppositions. I was just talking with Tony a second ago about the difference between biography and history and how one gets distance actually on things. And I have to say that it may be easier for me as a half a generation younger to get some of that distance. But let me start by just making absolutely clear that I wasn't there at the beginning, and by the beginning I mean for purposes of this panel, at the moment when the Institute became the Institute. I was here, in fact, in Cambridge, an undergraduate at Harvard in the early 70s, studying literature and creative writing. I didn't arrive at the Institute until the beginning of 1976. But what I'd like to, and I also should confess to yet another dimension of my connection to this material, which is that I was married to Bob Slutsky for 20 years. So what I'd like to use my 15 minutes or so to talk about in this concluding panel are both my own genealogical connection to this moment, but more generally to raise some issues regarding institutional foundations. Apropos of this, an interesting diagram, by the way, if you can read it here, you'll see Siam's agenda spelled out in diagrammatic form. Okay, so basically 2 points that I want to make to begin with here. The first of which is that Case was not Team 10, okay? Case was not an American Team 10, despite some claims that have been made to this effect over the years. Team 10 was reacting directly against its parent organization, Siam. In other words, it had a specific set of both Oedipal and ideological grievances and a history. Allison Smithson's book, Team 10 Out of Siam of 1982, documents this struggle in colorful detail. The members also succeeded in putting forward a coherent, if not monolithic, set of counter-arguments. In other words, they knew what they were against, and they also collectively could agree on many things that they were for. Case, on the other hand, at least as far as I can tell from studying the archive and what I know, was largely a group of younger architects in search of a program. Throughout its run, it never really managed to clarify whether it wanted to be a pressure group, a debating society, a social network, or an exclusive club. The impetus for its existence came less from any shared position than from a general desire to, quote, provide a forum, as its foundation statement of 1965 enunciated, with the intent, quote, to examine issues which its members feel to be central to architecture, unquote. These might encompass, according to the same statement, the city and mass phenomena, industrial techniques and construction, technological innovation, architecture and other disciplines, architecture and political structure, psychology of the architect, creativity, form, history and criticism, and education and architecture, this last including not only professional education, but also, quote, the need for visual education from primary school through adult education. The list, which seems to touch on everything but the kitchen sink, was so all-inclusive and bent over so far backward in accommodating all comers as to be utterly bland. As Colin Rowe did not hesitate to point out at the time, there was too much, and we heard Anna Maria quoted this, too much liberalistic tolerance and, as he also put it, Boy Scoutiness. At least this is what seemed to be emanating from one side of the equation, and organizational structuring and academic credentials and collegiality could not really overcome what was a basic lack of direction, a diffuseness. But Rowe was no less wary of the other side. I think we can identify this side with Peter, which veered rhetorically in the direction of the manifesto polemic and seemed, in his view, to harbor an embarrassing nostalgia for the messianic vocation of Siam. Whatever course lay between this Scylla and Charybdis proved difficult for Case to chart. Second point, the 60s did not end exactly on time. In fact, they spilled over for several years into the next decade. Even if 68 was a watershed moment of upheaval and spelled widespread disillusionment for many on the left, it took the invasion of Cambodia and the Kent State campus massacre, 1970, the Watergate break-ins, 1972, that would lead to Nixon's resignation 2 years later, the Arab oil embargo, 1973, the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis starting in 72, and a resultant professional preoccupation, a la Oscar Newman, a participant in Case, with defensible space at this point, rather than any more liberal idealism, or at least representing a certain change. And in New York, especially, or not especially, but certainly, a darkening financial picture that would lead by 1974-75 to a credit crunch and a city on the verge of bankruptcy and a federal government unwilling to throw the city a lifeline. The rise and fall of the Urban Development Corporation, established under Nelson Rockefeller in 1967 and helmed by Ed Logue until his forced resignation in 1975, reflected the collision between the idealistic optimism of government technocrats and the cynicism of a federal system no longer committed, as it had been in the mid and late 60s under Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society and Model Cities programs, to provide the level of funding and moral support necessary to address endemic urban decay. A point of culmination was reached with Nixon's moratorium on federal involvement in housing construction in 73, and John Lindsay's departure from the mayor's office in New York the same year. While an elite think tank, elite and quasi-independent think tank in Manhattan might be supposed to be able to exist at some remove from the direct impact of current events, in fact, the IAUS was dependent on funding from state and city agencies and had constructed its early projects in response to them. After this fell apart and politics shifted rightward, MoMA, under the direction of Arthur Drexler and with Philip Johnson's increasing involvement, would prove more reliable and powerful allies. In fact, the transformations that took place within the Institute from its formation in 1967, when the focus was on publicly funded pilot projects that would lend credence to the urban studies in its name, through the culturalist turn represented by the launch of oppositions in 1973, turn out to be a remarkably sensitive barometer and a remarkably good case study, pardon the pun, of the larger changes taking place in American society and politics. In this sense, if Case was to some extent a proving ground for the Institute, it also belonged to a different moment in time. Less launching pad, perhaps, and more booster rocket, something that had to be jettisoned for the Institute to reach velocity. Undoubtedly, Case laid some of the groundwork. Yet it's important, especially in light of a potentially canonizing event like today's, to approach the period in question with a micro-historical concreteness. So in the interests of microhistory and also just rummaging through some boxes in my shelves, and also just to give you some visual picture, which doesn't necessarily involve people, pictures, I've brought some slides. So you've seen the one on the left, case 8, and then the one on the right represents this moment when the name case is basically dropped. Both conferences taking place at MoMA. The left, this conference we've heard about called Pictorial and Literal Space, Architecture and Painting, the catalyst for what would become the 5 architects, the book and the group, and the polemics of whites and grays that we've talked about. And on the right, a second conference at MoMA where there's no mention of case anymore, but many of the same players that had been part of case so far. Both of these conferences take place in 1971, within the space of 6 months. 1971, I want to suggest, turns out to be a crucial year. So I also will call your attention to the fact that at case 8, after the Saturday, I think it was, event where the architects made their presentations, this was followed by a debate between Slutsky and Frank Stella, 2 painters, responded to by Rosalind Krauss and the art historian Sheldon Nodelman the next morning. So this architecture and painting thing seems to be anticipating things that will be coming, as does the title, as was pointed out, although pictorial and literal space, of course, is a variation on literal and phenomenal space, but we'll come back to transparency in a bit. So 2 publications that appear, published by the IAUS in 1971. I don't know if the one on the right is readable or not, but both of these graphics contributed by Bob Slutsky, but representing 2 different kinds of events that in a way bracket this change I'm talking about. So new urban settlements on the left, phase 1, analytical phase, the study of new towns, 6 new towns, from the perspective of cities as, quote, complex adaptive systems that can grow and change. Ken Frampton was instrumental in this project. It was also under the direction of Emilio Ambas and Peter Eisenman and 10 other people. And it was funded by 5 state and city agencies, including the Metropolitan Transit Authority and the Urban Development Corporation. On the right, what you see is the cover of a catalog for an exhibition called Art and Architecture, USSR, 1917-32, that took place in June 1971. Again, Kenneth played a major role in this, but the show itself actually came from the Netherlands, so already a kind of Dutch connection by way of Max Risselada, but also Gerrit Orthuis, who had come to the Institute, be close to Rem Koolhaas there, and MoMA, once again, as a good friend of the Institute, lent the model for lent the model for Le Corbusier's Palace of the Soviets for the exhibition. So already, really, we're seeing this alliance cemented and increasingly close during this period. Another event of 1971, this is the publication of the Casabella issue in December, that is a monographic bilingual issue on or dedicated or actually produced by people at the Institute, again with a lot of participation from former case members, so a bridge, but on the other hand, a new direction for sure. The title of this special issue, The City as an Artifact, signified, according to editor Alessandro Mendini, that an approach or an attitude toward the urban environment that was, quote, the very opposite of authoritarian planning. So, and as a personal note, City as Artifact, as was mentioned somewhere along the line, participated in a kind of co-translation of Aldo Rossi's Architecture in the City, and recently have had some questions from people about why we translated the word fatto as artifact rather than simply fact. And I think this issue actually is some good sort of argument for doing that. The word artifact was surely in the air. In any case, the issue was divided into three major sections, and you can see who contributed to them, I guess, in these slides. But the part one had a famously heated exchange between Denise Scott Brown and Ken Frampton over the issue of the commercial strip, the Las Vegas pop culture more generally, in which Scott Brown, of course, defended it. Frampton accused the Venturis of basically affirming the status quo in a so-called non-judgmental, as they like to say, way. And Scott Brown got the last word here, calling Frampton caught midway between a European and American social critique of things, and adding, I quote, "There is something disgraceful about sitting in a plush American university and taking superior armchair revolutionary potshots at the capitalists that support you there." In part two, there were contributions by Eisenman, Rickwert, Bill Ellis, Stan Anderson, and Tom Schumacher. Eisenman's contribution was titled Notes on Conceptual Architecture Towards a Definition. And here we find Peter making distinctions between art and architecture, using Solowitz's idea of the grid to kind of distinguish it from, or distinguish an architectural use of the grid, and also arguing for a deep structure in formal syntactical relationships in architecture, very much indebted to Noam Chomsky at this moment. Part three consisted of a publication of this proposal by Emilio Ambas that he would actually be able to partly realize just a month later in January '72, the Universitas Project, a new educational institution dedicated to design and development. And he didn't realize it, but he managed to mount an important conference dedicated to talking about it at MoMA in, as I say, January '72. So new themes that, to some extent, relate to things that we saw within Case's discussion, but already now being focused, becoming polemical, becoming very programmatic, and taking stands on things that, in a way, Case was always vacillating over. So another event of this same moment that, in fact, in conjunction with the conference that the Institute sponsored on architectural education, was an exhibition that came from Cooper Union. And this was the education of an architect. It opened together with the conference. It consisted of 50 projects by 40 students produced over the years that since Hayduck had arrived and become chair of the architecture school, that's since '64. And Slutsky also had arrived in '68, coming from Pratt. And in many ways, we could say that it was precisely the opposite of the discussions of architectural education that had taken place within Case. It was, as it was titled A Point of View, one that insisted on a kind of a rigorous and coherent position, attitude toward making architecture and thinking out of the making of architecture. Here you can see a couple of installation views of the show. And the book, also published in an edition of no more than 500 copies, 324 pages long, large format. I want to quote you from Ada Louise Huxtable's review of the show, which I think is quite interesting. Well, first, the show, I should say, was and the book were funded by the Graham Foundation and other friends, including Ulrich Franzen, who wrote an introduction in the catalog. And while what he states is that the Cooper Union work had been produced during a decade of upheaval and chaos in academia, and in academic as well as social values. And it contrasts, therefore, starkly with the curriculum confusion and striving for currency that one saw at other educational institutions in the 60s. So Huxtable echoes this view of Cooper Union's exceptionality in a long review, noting that the Cooper program ran completely counter to so-called radicalization of other schools and courses. In fact, she even says it's counter-revolutionary, and writes that, quote, while others rushed to embrace sociology and interdisciplinary studies, these students are dealing in complex, sophisticated, abstract, intellectual, and aesthetic exercises deliberately divorced from meaning and social issues, with a meticulous, exquisite draftsmanship that sends shivers up your spines. She then goes on to point out that the students at Cooper Union, for the most part, or many of them, came from less affluent backgrounds, and they certainly knew what these kinds of social issues were about and had experienced urban decay in their own lives. Nonetheless, they still were taking this stand on behalf of what she calls the kind of dignity of this kind of form making and craft that the work exhibited. So there was, as I say, a kind of coherent point of view represented by the show for sure. Everybody could certainly see that. And yet it wasn't absolutely monolithic either. There were divergences, different viewpoints under the umbrella that were represented, in particular between Hayduck and Slutsky, whose students' work in the catalog is counterposed to each other on black pages and white pages. Hayduck's students on the white pages treated the famous 9-square grid problem, a pedagogical problem that had been invented 15 years earlier at the University of Texas in Austin, as objects, as isolated objects. And Slutsky, on the other hand, his students on the black pages could be seen to view the 9-square problem as a problem of field and figure. And so the thinking that came out of Gestalt psychology and Gestalt education, which Slutsky had been engaged in while a student himself at Yale under Joseph Albers, and then would find its way also into the transparency essays he wrote with Rowe, was played out in this dialogue over a pedagogical problem. Here, these are slides that go back to the Texas period when Hayduck produced this series of Texas houses, and Slutsky and Hayduck's students experimented with a 9-square grid as a pedagogical tool for a introductory architectural course, a la Bauhaus. Apropos of these models, these comparisons, these precedents that we like to make, I think we have to be very careful. So Cooper Union is often said to be, well, the Bauhaus redux, and yet there again are significant differences. If it was the Bauhaus, one might say more early Bauhaus, like Johannes Itten moment, rather than what was to come. But in any case, it's interesting, apropos of this kind of microhistory I'm arguing for here, that this is a kind of reversion back to the 50s at this moment, the new formalism that seems to be emerging in the early 70s. It kind of jumps over this decade, this chaotic decade of the 60s, in order to pick up strands of things that maybe had sort of fallen out of the picture in the course of the 60s. The show and the catalog also included some projects by students that certainly were attuned to things that were going on in the bigger world, including some plug-in projects, one anyway that indebted to Archigram, and just, I mean, there is more variety than one would kind of think without looking more carefully. In this project, for example, one by a thesis project for this kind of serpentine slab, very much responding to issues of wind and structural stresses and all in kind of working out the scheme. In any case, construction, so we're not just talking about paper architecture by any means, but we're talking about a way of making architecture and then thinking about architecture through making. Again, we saw reference to this earlier. The second transparency article, which is what these diagrams were made for, made by Daniel Libeskind, who was a student at Cooper at this time. The second transparency would be published in an issue of Perspecta, the Yale Journal, the big fat double issue, 1314, dated 1971 again. In fact, the copyright date is kind of misleading because the issue didn't come out until early 73, as far as I understand it. In any case, the second transparency article picked up on the argument that had been made in the first, but particularly focused on the issue of the facade plane. And again, apropos of where things are heading, it's significant that, again, even though the articles were written back in the 50s, they don't get published until belatedly. So Transparency 1 was published in 1963, but Transparency 2 came out in this Perspecta issue in the early 70s. That publication, or the preparation of these articles that had long laid sort of unpublished, and finally Perspecta took them on in the 60s. By the time of the second one, this kind of stimulated Rowe and Slutsky to think about going back to the third transparency article, which they'd always intended to write, never got a chance to finish. And so many notes were kind of generated for this third article right around this time. These are a couple from Bob, pages from Bob. You can see on the right where some notes, presumably for kind of conclusion, where he's actually referring to the Stella Nodelman conversation that took place in that MoMA conference. But what he's also arguing against here, and apparently it presumably would have been a pretty polemical conclusion, was against the kind of reductiveness of a kind of systems thinking that he sensed as dominant and lacked what he considered to be a kind of dialectical logic. And so that's, you get a peek at these notes. Also in this double issue of Perspecta appeared this beautiful publication of Peter's analysis of Tirani's Giuliani Frigerio building. I believe this is the first publication of it, with extraordinary diagrams and also historical photos. So Tirani and Mies would have also figured in that Transparency 3. I don't know if you saw the notation on the page I just showed you, but in any case, we're now seeing history returned and analyzed, and this kind of thinking, which also, of course, enters into Peter's own architecture with the series of numbered houses, which begin with House 1 in '67, the same year the Institute gets founded. Also, again, is shifting things. Now, the book comes out in '73 toward this new formalism. But ironically, going back to the Education of an Architect show for a moment, another reviewer of the show, somebody who didn't, unsigned article that appeared in Architectural Forum in a piece called 1920 Revisited, said that not since the École des Beaux-Arts had there been such a shining, that's his, the author's term, such a shining display of draftsmanship and elegance in architecture. And in a way, we can see in how in 1976 this might well lead to the show at MoMA of the architecture of the École des Beaux-Arts. So this progression, this transformation that occurs over the course of the early 70s ultimately would lead to Oppositions 8, which was a special issue that was edited by Tony Vidler on Paris under the Academy. So Oppositions 1, 1973, Oppositions 8 on the École, and dated spring '77, actually. So we're now in '77. Vidler, in his introduction, argues against any neat reversal of the values of modernism and academicism, yet he acknowledges the necessity for a truly critical history of modern architecture. He writes, it becomes increasingly clear that to accept the ideological rupture proposed by modernism itself as the instrument of its own interpretation is to deliberately obscure the circumstances of its origins and the nature of its production. In addressing these themes and seeing them as critical to any informed discussion of modernism and thereby of postmodernism, it is not the intention of Oppositions to found a new orthodoxy. Rather, we hope to encourage the investigation of the recent past as an instrument for the analysis and criticism of the present. So that's the first mention of the word postmodernism in Oppositions. The word had almost been taboo for 7 issues, but with issue 8, a fait accompli has been acknowledged. MoMA's scandalous, almost, decision, Arthur Drexler, to present this 19th century school at a museum of modern art was absorbed and now would be taken for a critical exegesis and analysis and debate within the Institute. And so the Institute finally became what I would call the Institute, capping a decade of evolution that, as we've seen, left behind Case's Pirandellian search for program, passed through an initial period focused on public programs, public projects and urban studies, that was strongly motivated by funding opportunities and a product of its time, before polemically identifying itself with formalist aesthetics and European avant-garde practice and theory, finally to arrive at a revisionist understanding of modernism and a new historiography as its central intellectual project. It's significant that this period of transformation and redefinition also coincided with a very uneasy process of institutionalization, one that never came to fruition at the Institute, both as a result of external pressures from a city on the brink of bankruptcy, and also some insurmountable internal contradictions. Thanks.